Part Third, Chapter 4 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Carpenter. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part Third, The Lighthouse. Chapter 4. Charles Gould turned towards the town. Before him the jagged peaks of the Sierra came out all black in the clear dawn. Here and there a muffled lepero whisked round the corner of a grass-grown street before the ringing hoofs of his horse. Dogs barked behind the walls of the gardens, and with the colourless light the chill of the snows seemed to fall from the mountains upon the disjointed pavements and the shuttered houses with broken cornices and the plaster peeling in patches between the flat pilasters of the fronts. The daybreak struggled with the gloom under the arcades on the plaza, with no signs of the country people disposing their goods for the day's market. Piles of fruit, bundles of vegetables ornamented with flowers, on low benches under enormous mat umbrellas, with no cheery early morning bustle of villagers, women, children, and loaded donkeys. Only a few scattered knots of revolutionists stood in the vast space, all looking one way from under their slouched hats for some sign of news from Rincon. The largest of those groups turned about like one man as Charles Gould passed, and shouted "Viva la libertad!" after him in a menacing tone. Charles Gould rode on, and turned into the archway of his house. In the patio, littered with straw, a practicante, one of Dr. Monygham's native assistants, sat on the ground with his back against the rim of the fountain, fingering a guitar discreetly, while two girls of the lower class standing up before him shuffled their feet a little and waved their arms, humming a popular dance tune. Most of the wounded during the 2 days of rioting had been taken away already by their friends and relations, but several figures could be seen sitting up balancing their bandaged heads in time to the music. Charles Gould dismounted. A sleepy mozo coming out of the bakery door took hold of the horse's bridle. The practicante endeavoured to conceal his guitar hastily. The girls, unabashed, stepped back smiling, and Charles Gould, on his way to the staircase, glanced into a dark corner of the patio at another group, a mortally wounded cargador, with a woman kneeling by his side. She mumbled prayers rapidly, trying at the same time to force a piece of orange between the stiffening lips of the dying man. The cruel futility of things stood unveiled in the levity and sufferings of that incorrigible people. The cruel futility of lives and of deaths thrown away in the vain endeavour to attain an enduring solution of the problem. Unlike Decoud, Charles Gould could not play lightly a part in a tragic farce. It was tragic enough for him in all conscience, but he could see no farcical element. He suffered too much under a conviction of irremediable folly. He was too severely practical and too idealistic to look upon its terrible humours with amusement, as Martin Decoud, the imaginative materialist, was able to do in the dry light of his scepticism. To him, as to all of us, the compromises with his conscience appeared uglier than ever in the light of failure. His taciturnity, assumed with a purpose, had prevented him from tampering openly with his thoughts. But the Gould concession had insidiously corrupted his judgment. He might have known, he said to himself, leaning over the balustrade of the corredor, that Ribierism could never come to anything. The mine had corrupted his judgment by making him sick of bribing and intriguing merely to have his work left alone from day to day. Like his father, he did not like to be robbed. It exasperated him. He had persuaded himself that, apart from higher considerations, the backing up of Don Jose's hopes of reform was good business. He had gone forth into the senseless fray, as his poor uncle, whose sword hung on the wall of his study, had gone forth, in the defence of the commonest decencies of organized society. Only his weapon was the wealth of the mine, more far-reaching and subtle than an honest blade of steel fitted into a simple brass guard. More dangerous to the wielder, too, this weapon of wealth, double-edged, with the cupidity and misery of mankind, steeped in all the vices of self-indulgence, as a concoction of poisonous roots, tainting the very cause for which it is drawn, always ready to turn awkwardly in the hand. There was nothing for it now but to go on using it. But he promised himself to see it shattered into small bits before he let it be wrenched from his grasp. After all, with his English parentage and English upbringing, he perceived that he was an adventurer in Costaguana, the descendant of adventurers enlisted in a foreign legion, of men who had sought fortune in a revolutionary war, who had planned revolutions, who had believed in revolutions. For all the uprightness of his character, he had something of an adventurer's easy morality which takes count of personal risk in the ethical appraising of his action. He was prepared, if need be, to blow up the whole San Tome mountain sky high out of the territory of the Republic. This resolution expressed the tenacity of his character, the remorse of that subtle conjugal infidelity through which his wife was no longer the sole mistress of his thoughts, something of his father's imaginative weakness, and something, too, of the spirit of a buccaneer, throwing a lighted match into the magazine rather than surrender his ship. Down below, in the patio, the wounded cargador had breathed his last. The woman cried out once, and her cry, unexpected and shrill, made all the wounded sit up. The practicante scrambled to his feet, and, guitar in hand, gazed steadily in her direction with elevated eyebrows. The two girls, sitting now one on each side of their wounded relative, with their knees drawn up and long cigars between their lips, nodded at each other significantly. Charles Gould, looking down over the balustrade, saw three men dressed ceremoniously in black frock coats with white shirts and wearing European round hats, enter the patio from the street. One of them, head and shoulders taller than the two others, advanced with marked gravity, leading the way. This was Don Juste Lopez, accompanied by two of his friends, members of Assembly, coming to call upon the Administrador of the San Tome mine at this early hour. They saw him, too, waved their hands to him urgently, walking up the stairs as if in procession. Don Juste, astonishingly changed by having shaved off altogether his damaged beard, had lost with it 9/10 of his outward dignity. Even at that time of serious preoccupation, Charles Gould could not help noting the revealed ineptitude in the aspect of the man. His companions looked crestfallen and sleepy. One kept on passing the tip of his tongue over his parched lips. The other's eyes strayed dully over the tiled floor of the corredor, while Don Juste, standing a little in advance, harangued the Senor Administrador of the San Tome mine. It was his firm opinion that forms had to be observed. A new governor is always visited by deputations from the Cabildo, which is the municipal council, from the Consulado, the commercial board, and it was proper that the provincial assembly should send a deputation too, if only to assert the existence of parliamentary institutions. Don Juste proposed that Don Carlos Gould, as the most prominent citizen of the province, should join the Assembly's deputation. His position was exceptional, his personality known through the length and breadth of the whole Republic. Official courtesies must not be neglected if they are gone through with a bleeding heart. The acceptance of accomplished facts may save yet the precious vestiges of parliamentary institutions. Don Juste's eyes glowed dully. He believed in parliamentary institutions, and the convinced drone of his voice lost itself in the stillness of the house, like the deep buzzing of some ponderous insect. Charles Gould had turned round to listen patiently, leaning his elbow on the balustrade. He shook his head a little, refusing, almost touched by the anxious gaze of the president of the provincial assembly. It was not Charles Gould's policy to make the San Tome mine a party to any formal proceedings. "My advice, senores, is that you should wait for your fate in your houses. There is no necessity for you to give yourselves up formally into Montero's hands. Submission to the inevitable, as Don Juste calls it, is all very well, but when the inevitable is called Pedrito Montero, there is no need to exhibit pointedly the whole extent of your surrender. The fault of this country is the want of measure in political life. Flat acquiescence in illegality, followed by sanguinary reaction, that, senores, is not the way to a stable and prosperous future." Charles Gould stopped before the sad bewilderment of the faces, the wondering, anxious glances of the eyes. The feeling of pity for those men, putting all their trust into words of some sort, while murder and rapine stalked over the land, had betrayed him into what seemed empty loquacity. Don Juste murmured, "You are abandoning us, Don Carlos. And yet parliamentary institutions." He could not finish from grief. For a moment he put his hand over his eyes. Charles Gould, in his fear of empty loquacity, made no answer to the charge. He returned in silence their ceremonious bows. His taciturnity was his refuge. He understood that what they sought was to get the influence of the San Tome mine on their side. They wanted to go on a conciliating errand to the victor under the wing of the Gould concession. Other public bodies, the Cabildo, the Consulado, would be coming too presently, seeking the support of the most stable, the most effective force they had ever known to exist in their province. The doctor, arriving with his sharp, jerky walk, found that the master had retired into his own room with orders not to be disturbed on any account. But Dr. Monygham was not anxious to see Charles Gould at once. He spent some time in a rapid examination of his wounded. He gazed down upon each in turn, rubbing his chin between his thumb and forefinger, His steady stare met without expression their silently inquisitive look. All these cases were doing well. But when he came to the dead Cargador, he stopped a little longer, surveying not the man who had ceased to suffer, but the woman kneeling in silent contemplation of the rigid face, with its pinched nostrils and a white gleam in the imperfectly closed eyes. She lifted her head slowly, and said in a dull voice, "It is not long since he had become a Cargador. Only a few weeks. His worship the capataz had accepted him after many entreaties." "I am not responsible for the great capataz," muttered the doctor, moving off, directing his course upstairs towards the door of Charles Gould's room. The doctor, at the last moment, hesitated, then, turning away from the handle with a shrug of his uneven shoulders, slunk off hastily along the corredor in search of Mrs. Gould's camerista. Leonardo told him that the senora had not risen yet. The senora had given into her charge the girls belonging to that Italian posadero. She, Leonarda, had put them to bed in her own room. The fair girl had cried herself to sleep, but the dark one, the bigger, had not closed her eyes yet. She sat up in bed, clutching the sheets right up to her chin and staring before her like a little witch. Leonarda did not approve of the Viola children being admitted to the house. She made this feeling clear by the indifferent tone in which she inquired whether their mother was dead yet. As to the senora, she must be asleep. Ever since she had gone into her room after seeing the departure of Dona Antonia with her dying father, there had been no sound behind her door. The doctor, rousing himself out of profound reflection, told her abruptly to call her mistress at once. He hobbled off to wait for Mrs. Gould in the sala. He was very tired, but too excited to sit down. In this great drawing room, now empty, in which his withered soul had been refreshed after many arid years, and his outcast spirit had accepted silently the toleration of many side glances, he wandered haphazard amongst the chairs and tables, till Mrs. Gould, enveloped in a morning wrapper, came in rapidly. "You know that I never approved of the silver being sent away," the doctor began at once, as a preliminary to the narrative of his night's adventures in association with Captain Mitchell, the engineer-in-chief, and old Viola, at Sotillo's headquarters. To the doctor, with his special conception of this political crisis, the removal of the silver had seemed an irrational and ill-omened measure. It was as if a general were sending the best part of his troops away on the eve of battle upon some recondite pretext. The whole lot of ingots might have been concealed somewhere, where they could have been got at for the purpose of staving off the dangers which were menacing the security of the Gould concession. The administrador had acted as if the immense and powerful prosperity of the mine had been founded on the methods of probity, on the sense of usefulness. And it was nothing of the kind. The method followed had been the only one possible. The Gould concession had ransomed its way through all those years. It was a nauseous process. He quite understood that Charles Gould had got sick of it, and had left the old path to back up that hopeless attempt at reform. The doctor did not believe in the reform of Costaguana. And now the mine was back again in its old path, with the disadvantage that henceforth it had to deal not only with the greed provoked by its wealth, but with the resentment awakened by the attempt to free itself from its bondage to moral corruption. That was the penalty of failure. What made him uneasy was that Charles Gould seemed to him to have weakened at the decisive moment when a frank return to the old methods was the only chance. Listening to Decoud's wild scheme had been a weakness. The doctor flung up his arms, exclaiming, "Decoud! Decoud!" He hobbled about the room with slight, angry laughs. Many years ago both his ankles had been seriously damaged in the course of a certain investigation conducted in the castle of Santa Marta by a commission composed of military men. Their nomination had been signified to them unexpectedly at the dead of night, with a scowling brow, flashing eyes, and in a tempestuous voice, by Guzman Bento. The old tyrant, maddened by one of his sudden accesses of suspicion, mingled spluttering appeals to their fidelity with imprecations and horrible menaces. The cells and casements of the castle on the hill had been already filled with prisoners. The commission was charged now with the task of discovering the iniquitous conspiracy against the citizen saviour of his country. Their dread of the raving tyrant translated itself into a hasty ferocity of procedure. The citizen saviour was not accustomed to wait. A conspiracy had to be discovered. The courtyards of the castle resounded with the clanking of leg irons, sounds of blows, yells of pain, and the commission of high officers laboured feverishly, concealing their distress and apprehensions from each other, and especially from their secretary, Father Beron, an army chaplain, at that time very much in the confidence of the citizen saviour. That priest was a big round-shouldered man with an unclean-looking, overgrown tonsure on the top of his flat head, of a dingy yellow complexion, softly fat, with greasy stains all down the front of his lieutenant's uniform, and a small cross embroidered in white cotton on his left breast. He had a heavy nose and a pendant lip. Dr. Monygham remembered him still. He remembered him against all the force of his will striving its utmost to forget. Father Beron had been adjoined to the commission by Guzman Bento, expressly for the purpose that his enlightened zeal should assist them in their labours. Dr. Monygham could by no manner of means forget the zeal of Father Beron, or his face, or the pitiless, monotonous voice in which he pronounced the words, "Will you confess now?" This memory did not make him shudder, but it had made of him what he was in the eyes of respectable people, a man careless of common decencies, something between a clever vagabond and a disreputable doctor. But not all respectable people would have had the necessary delicacy of sentiment to understand with what trouble of mind and accuracy of vision Dr. Monygham, medical officer of the San Tome mine, remembered Father Beron, army chaplain, and once a secretary of a military commission. After all these years, Dr. Monygham, in his rooms at the end of the hospital building in the San Tome gorge, remembered Father Beron as distinctly as ever. He remembered that priest at night sometimes in his sleep. On such nights the doctor waited for daylight with a candle lighted, and walking the whole length of his rooms to and fro, staring down at his bare feet, his arms hugging his sides tightly, he would dream of Father Beron sitting at the end of a long black table behind which in a row appeared the heads, shoulders, and epaulettes of the military members, nibbling the feather of a quill pen, and listening with a weary and impatient scorn to the protestations of some prisoner, calling heaven to witness of his innocence, till he burst out, "What's the use of wasting time over that miserable nonsense? Let me take him outside for a while." And Father Beron would go outside after the clanking prisoner, led away between two soldiers. Such interludes happened on many days, many times, with many prisoners. When the prisoner returned he was ready to make a full confession. Father Beron would declare, leaning forward with that dull, surfeited look which can be seen in the eyes of gluttonous persons after a heavy meal. The priest's inquisitorial instinct suffered but little from the want of classical apparatus of the Inquisition. At no time of the world's history have men been at a loss how to inflict mental and bodily anguish upon their fellow creatures. This aptitude came to them in the growing complexity of their passions and the early refinement of their ingenuity. But it may safely be said that primeval man did not go to the trouble of inventing tortures. He was indolent and pure of heart. He brained his neighbor ferociously with a stone axe from necessity and without malice. The stupidest mind may invent a rankling phrase, or brand the innocent with a cruel aspersion. A piece of string and a ramrod, a few muskets in combination with a length of hide rope, or even a simple mallet of heavy hard wood applied with a swing to human fingers or to the joints of a human body, is enough for the infliction of the most exquisite torture. The doctor had been a very stubborn prisoner, and as a natural consequence of that bad disposition, so Father Beron called it, his subjugation had been very crushing and very complete. That is why the limp in his walk, the twist of his shoulders, the scars on his cheeks were so pronounced. His confessions, when they came at last, were very complete too. Sometimes on the nights when he walked the floor he wondered, grinding his teeth with shame and rage, at the fertility of his imagination when stimulated by a sort of pain which makes truth, honor, self-respect, and life itself matters of little moment. And he could not forget Father Beron with his monotonous phrase, "Will you confess now?" reaching him in an awful iteration and lucidity of meaning through the delirious incoherence of unbearable pain. He could not forget. But that was not the worst. Had he met Father Beron in the street after all these years, Dr. Monygham was sure he would have quailed before him. This contingency was not to be feared now. Father Beron was dead. But the sickening certitude prevented Dr. Monygham from looking anybody in the face. Dr. Monygham had become, in a manner, the slave of a ghost. It was obviously impossible to take his knowledge of Father Beron home to Europe. When making his extorted confessions to the military board, Dr. Monygham was not seeking to avoid death. He longed for it. Sitting half naked for hours on the wet earth of his prison, and so motionless that the spiders, his companions, attached their webs to his matted hair, he consoled the misery of his soul with acute reasonings that he had confessed to crimes enough for a sentence of death, that they had gone too far with him to let him live to tell the tale. But as if by a refinement of cruelty, Dr. Monygham was left for months to decay slowly in the darkness of his grave-like prison. It was no doubt hoped that it would finish him off without the trouble of an execution. But Dr. Monygham had an iron constitution. It was Guzman Bento who died, not by the knife thrust of a conspirator, but from a stroke of apoplexy. And Dr. Monygham was liberated hastily. His fetters were struck off by the light of a candle which, after months of gloom, hurt his eyes so much that he had to cover his face with his hands. He was raised up. His heart was beating violently with the fear of this liberty. When he tried to walk, the extraordinary lightness of his feet made him giddy, and he fell down. 2 sticks were thrust into his hands, and he was pushed out of the passage. It was dusk. Candles glimmered already in the windows of the officers' quarters round the courtyard, but the twilight sky dazed him by its enormous and overwhelming brilliance. A thin poncho hung over his naked, bony shoulders, the rags of his trousers came down no lower than his knees, and 18 months' growth of hair fell in dirty grey locks on each side of his sharp cheekbones. As he dragged himself past the guard-room door, one of the soldiers lolling outside, moved by some obscure impulse, leaped forward with a strange laugh and rammed a broken old straw hat on his head. And Dr. Monygham, after having tottered, continued on his way. He advanced 1 stick, then 1 maimed foot, then the other stick. The other foot followed only a very short distance along the ground, toilfully, as though it were almost too heavy to be moved at all. And yet his legs, under the hanging angles of the poncho, appeared no thicker than the 2 sticks in his hands. A ceaseless trembling agitated his bent body, all his wasted limbs, his bony head, the conical ragged crown of the sombrero whose ample flat rim rested on his shoulders. In such conditions of manner and attire did Dr. Monygham go forth to take possession of his liberty. And these conditions seemed to bind him indissolubly to the land of Costaguana, like an awful procedure of naturalization, involving him deep in the national life, far deeper than any amount of success and honor could have done. They did away with his Europeanism, for Dr. Monygham had made himself an ideal conception of his disgrace. It was a conception eminently fit and proper for an officer and a gentleman. Dr. Monygham, before he went out to Costaguana, had been a surgeon in one of Her Majesty's regiments of foot. It was a conception which took no account of physiological facts or reasonable arguments. But it was not stupid for all that. It was simple. A rule of conduct resting mainly on severe rejections is necessarily simple. Dr. Monygham's view of what it behooved him to do was severe. It was an ideal view, in so much that it was the imaginative exaggeration of a correct feeling. It was also, in its force, influence, and persistency, the view of an eminently loyal nature. There was a great fund of loyalty in Dr. Monygham's nature. He had settled it all on Mrs. Gould's head. He believed her worthy of every devotion. At the bottom of his heart he felt an angry uneasiness before the prosperity of the San Tome mine, because its growth was robbing her of all peace of mind. Costaguana was no place for a woman of that kind. What could Charles Gould have been thinking of when he brought her out there? It was outrageous. And the doctor had watched the course of events with a grim and distant reserve, which he imagined his lamentable history imposed upon him. Loyalty to Mrs. Gould could not, however, leave out of account the safety of her husband. The doctor had contrived to be in town at the critical time because he mistrusted Charles Gould. He considered him hopelessly infected with the madness of revolutions. That is why he hobbled in distress in the drawing-room of the Casa Gould on that morning, exclaiming, "Decoud! Decoud!" in a tone of mournful irritation. Mrs. Gould, her colour heightened, and with glistening eyes, looked straight before her at the sudden enormity of that disaster. The finger-tips on one hand rested lightly on a low little table by her side, and the arm trembled right up to the shoulder. The sun, which looks late upon Sulaco, issuing in all the fullness of its power high up on the sky from behind the dazzling snow-edge of Higuerota, had precipitated the delicate, smooth, pearly greyness of light, in which the town lies steeped during the early hours, into sharp-cut masses of black shade and spaces of hot, blinding glare. 3 long rectangles of sunshine fell through the windows of the sala, while just across the street the front of the Avellanos' house appeared very sombre in its own shadow, seen through the flood of light. A voice said at the door, "What of Decoud?" It was Charles Gould. They had not heard him coming along the corredor. His glance just glided over his wife and struck full at the doctor. "You have brought some news, doctor." Dr. Monygham blurted it all out at once, in the rough. For some time after he had done, the administrador of the San Tome mine remained looking at him without a word. Mrs. Gould sank into a low chair with her hands lying on her lap. A silence reigned between those three motionless persons. Then Charles Gould spoke. "You must want some breakfast." He stood aside to let his wife pass first. She caught up her husband's hand and pressed it as she went out, raising her handkerchief to her eyes. The sight of her husband had brought Antonia's position to her mind, and she could not contain her tears at the thought of the poor girl. When she rejoined the two men in the dining room after having bathed her face, Charles Gould was saying to the doctor across the table, "No, there does not seem to be any room for doubt." And the doctor assented. "No, I don't see myself how we could question that wretched Hirsch's tale. It's only too true, I fear." She sat down desolately at the head of the table and looked from one to the other. The two men, without absolutely turning their heads away, tried to avoid her glance. The doctor even made a show of being hungry. He seized his knife and fork and began to eat with emphasis, as if on the stage. Charles Gould made no pretense of the sort. With his elbows raised squarely, he twisted both ends of his flaming moustaches. They were so long that his hands were quite away from his face. "I am not surprised," he muttered, abandoning his moustaches and throwing one arm over the back of the chair. His face was calm with that immobility of expression which betrays the intensity of a mental struggle. He felt that this accident had brought to a point all the consequences involved in his line of conduct, with its conscious and subconscious intentions. There must be an end now of this silent reserve, of that air of impenetrability behind which he had been safeguarding his dignity. It was the least ignoble form of dissembling forced upon him by that parody of civilized institutions which offended his intelligence, his uprightness, and his sense of right. He was like his father. He had no ironic eye. He was not amused at the absurdities that prevail in this world. They hurt him in his innate gravity. He felt that the miserable death of that poor Decoud took from him his inaccessible position of a force in the background. It committed him openly unless he wished to throw up the game, and that was impossible. The material interests required from him the sacrifice of his aloofness, perhaps his own safety too, and he reflected that Decoud's separationist plan had not gone to the bottom with the lost silver. The only thing that was not changed was his position towards Mr. Holroyd. The head of silver and steel interests had entered into Costaguana affairs with a sort of passion. Costaguana had become necessary to his existence. In the San Tome mine he had found the imaginative satisfaction which other mines would get from drama, from art, or from a risky and fascinating sport. It was a special form of the great man's extravagance, sanctioned by a moral intention, big enough to flatter his vanity. Even in this aberration of his genius he served the progress of the world. Charles Gould felt sure of being understood with precision and judged with the indulgence of their common passion. Nothing now could surprise or startle this great man, and Charles Gould imagined himself writing a letter to San Francisco in some such words: "The men at the head of the movement are dead or have fled. The civil organization of the province is at an end for the present. The Blanco party in Sulaco has collapsed, inexcusably, but in the characteristic manner of this country. But Barrios, untouched in Cayta, remains still available. I am forced to take up openly the plan of a provincial revolution as the only way of placing the enormous material interests involved in the prosperity and peace of Sulaco in a position of permanent safety." That was clear. He saw these words as if written in letters of fire upon the wall at which he was gazing abstractedly. Mrs. Gould watched his abstraction with dread. It was a domestic and frightful phenomenon that darkened and chilled the house for her like a thundercloud passing over the sun. Charles Gould's fits of abstraction depicted the energetic concentration of a will haunted by a fixed idea. A man haunted by a fixed idea is insane. He is dangerous even if that idea is an idea of justice. For may he not bring the heaven down pitilessly upon a loved head? The eyes of Mrs. Gould, watching her husband's profile, filled with tears again, and again she seemed to see the despair of the unfortunate Antonia. "What would I have done if Charlie had been drowned while we were engaged?" she exclaimed mentally with horror. Her heart turned to ice, while her cheeks flamed up as if scorched by the blaze of a funeral pyre consuming all her earthly affections. The tears burst out of her eyes. "Antonia will kill herself!" she cried out. This cry fell into the silence of the room with strangely little effect. Only the doctor, crumbling up a piece of bread, with his head inclined on one side, raised his face, and the few long hairs sticking out of his shaggy eyebrows stirred in a slight frown. Dr. Monygham thought quite sincerely that Decoud was a singularly unworthy object for any woman's affection. Then he lowered his head again with a curl of his lip and his heart full of tender admiration for Mrs. Gould. "She thinks of that girl," he said to himself. "She thinks of the Viola children. She thinks of me, of the wounded, of the miners. She always thinks of everybody who is poor and miserable. But what will she do if Charles gets the worst of it in this infernal scrimmage those confounded Avellanos have drawn him into? No one seems to be thinking of her." Charles Gould, staring at the wall, pursued his reflections subtly. "I shall write to Holroyd that the San Tome mine is big enough to take in hand the making of a new state. It'll please him. It'll reconcile him to the risk." But was Barrios really available? Perhaps. But he was inaccessible. To send off a boat to Cayta was no longer possible, since Sotillo was master of the harbour and had a steamer at his disposal. And now, with all the Democrats in the province up, and every Campo township in a state of disturbance, where could he find a man who would make his way successfully overland to Cayta with a message? A 10 days' ride at least, a man of courage and resolution who would avoid arrest or murder, and if arrested would faithfully eat the paper. The capataz de cargadores would have been just such a man. But the capataz de cargadores was no more. And Charles Gould, withdrawing his eyes from the wall, said gently, "That Hirsch, what an extraordinary thing! Saved himself by clinging to the anchor, did he? I had no idea that he was still in Sulaco. I thought he had gone back overland to Esmeralda more than a week ago. He came here once to talk to me about his hide business and some other things. I made it clear to him that nothing could be done." "He was afraid to start back on account of Hernandez being about," remarked the doctor. "And but for him we might not have known anything of what has happened," marvelled Charles Gould. Mrs. Gould cried out, "Antonia must not know. She must not be told. Not now." "Nobody's likely to carry the news," remarked the doctor. "It's of no one's interest. Moreover, the people here are afraid of Hernandez as if he were the devil." He turned to Charles Gould. "It's even awkward, because if you wanted to communicate with the refugees you could find no messenger. When Hernandez was ranging hundreds of miles away from here, the Sulaco populace used to shudder at the tales of him roasting his prisoners alive." "Yes," murmured Charles Gould. "Captain Mitchell's capataz was the only man in town who had seen Hernandez eye to eye. Father Corbelan employed him. He opened the communications first. It is a pity that—" His voice was covered by the booming of the great bell of the cathedral. 3 single strokes, one after another, burst out explosively, dying away in deep and mellow vibrations. And then all the bells in the tower of every church, convent, or chapel in town, even those that had remained shut up for years, pealed out together with a crash. In this furious flood of metallic uproar there was a power of suggesting images of strife and violence which blanched Mrs. Gould's cheek. Basilio, who had been waiting at table, shrinking within himself, clung to the sideboard with chattering teeth. It was impossible to hear yourself speak. "Shut these windows!" Charles Gould yelled at him angrily. All of the other servants, terrified at what they took for this signal of a general massacre, had rushed upstairs, tumbling over each other, men and women, the obscure and generally invisible population of the ground floor on the 4 sides of the patio. The women, screaming "Misericordia!" ran right into the room, and, falling on their knees against the walls, began to cross themselves convulsively. The staring heads of men blocked the doorway in an instant. Mozos from the stable, gardeners, nondescript helpers living on the crumbs of the munificent house, and Charles Gould beheld all the extent of his domestic establishment even to the gatekeeper. This was a half-paralyzed old man, whose long white locks fell down to his shoulders, an heirloom taken up by Charles Gould's familial piety. He could remember Henry Gould, an Englishman and a Costaguanero of the 2nd generation, chief of the Sulaco province. He had been his personal mozo years and years ago in peace and war, and had been allowed to attend his master in prison. Had, on the fatal morning, followed the firing squad, and peeping from behind one of the cypresses growing along the wall of the Franciscan convent, had seen, with his eyes starting out of his head, Don Enrique throw up his hands and fall with his face in the dust. Charles Gould noted particularly the big patriarchal head of that witness in the rear of the other servants. But he was surprised to see a shriveled old hag or two, of whose existence within the walls of his house he had not been aware. They must have been the mothers or even the grandmothers of some of his people. There were a few children, too, more or less naked, crying and clinging to the legs of their elders. He had never before noticed any sign of a child in his patio. Even Leonarda, the camerista, came in a fright, pushing through with her spoiled, pouting face of a favourite maid, leading the Viola girls by the hand. The crockery rattled on table and sideboard, and the whole house seemed to sway in the deafening wave of sound. End of chapter 4.
Part 3, Chapter 5 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3, The Lighthouse, Chapter 5. During the night, the expectant populace had taken possession of all the belfries in the town in order to welcome Pedrito Montero, who was making his entry after having slept the night in Rincon. And first came straggling in through the land gate the armed mob of all colours, complexions, types, and states of raggedness, calling themselves the Sulaco National Guard, and commanded by Señor Gamacho. Through the middle of the street streamed, like a torrent of rubbish, a mass of straw hats, ponchos, gun barrels, with an enormous green and yellow flag, flapping in the midst, in a cloud of dust, to the furious beating of drums. The spectators recoiled against the walls of the houses, shouting their vivas. Behind the rabble could be seen the lances of the cavalry, the army of Pedro Montero. He advanced between Señores Fuentes and Gamacho at the head of his llaneros, who had accomplished the feat of crossing the paramos of the Higuerota in a snowstorm. They rode four abreast, mounted on confiscated Campo horses, clad in the heterogeneous stock of roadside stores they had looted hurriedly in their rapid ride through the northern part of the province. For Pedro Montero had been in a great hurry to occupy Sulaco. The handkerchiefs knotted loosely around their bare throats were glaringly new, and all the right sleeves of their cotton shirts had been cut off close to the shoulder for greater freedom in throwing the lasso. Emaciated grey birds rode by the side of the lean dark youths, marked by all the hardships of campaigning, with strips of raw beef twined round the crowns of their hats, and huge iron spurs fastened to their naked heels. Those that in the passes of the mountain had lost their lances had provided themselves with the goads used by the Campo cattlemen. Slender shafts of palm fully 10 feet long, with a lot of loose rings jingling under the iron shot point. They were armed with knives and revolvers. A haggard fearlessness characterized the expression of all these sun-black countenances. They glared down haughtily with their scorched eyes at the crowd, or, blinking upwards insolently, pointed out to each other some particular head amongst the women at the windows. When they had ridden into the plaza and caught sight of the equestrian statue of the king dazzlingly white in the sunshine, towering enormous and motionless above the surges of the crowd, with its eternal gesture of saluting, a murmur of surprise ran through their ranks. "What is that saint in the big hat?" they asked each other. They were a good sample of the cavalry of the plains, with which Pedro Montero had helped so much of the victorious career of his brother the general. The influence which that man brought up in coast towns, acquired in a short time over the placement of the republic, can be ascribed only to a genius for treachery of so effective the kind that it must have appeared to those violent men but little removed from a state of utter savagery as the perfection of sagacity and virtue. The popular lore of all nations testifies that duplicity and cunning, together with bodily strength, were looked upon, even more than courage, as heroic virtues by primitive mankind. To overcome your adversary was the great affair of life. Courage was taken for granted. But the use of intelligence awakened wonder and respect. The stratagems, providing they did not fail, were honourable. The easy massacre of an unsuspecting enemy evoked no feelings but those of gladness, pride, and admiration. Not, perhaps, that primitive men were more faithless than their descendants of to-day, but that they were straighter to their aim, and were more artless in the recognition of success as the only standard of morality. We have changed since. The use of intelligence awakens little wonder and less respect. But the ignorant and barbarous plainsmen engaging in civil strife followed willingly a leader who often managed to deliver their enemies bound, as if it were, into their hands. Pedro Montero had a talent for lulling his adversaries into a sense of security, and as men learn wisdom with extreme slowness, and are always ready to believe promises that flatter their secret hopes, Pedro Montero was successful time after time. Whether only a servant of some imperial official in the Costaguana legation in Paris, he had rushed back to his country directly he heard that his brother had emerged from the obscurity of his frontier commandancia. He had managed to deceive by his gift of plausibility the chiefs of the Ribierist movement in the capital, and even the acute agent of the San Tome mind had failed to understand him thoroughly. At once he had obtained an enormous influence over his brother. They were very much alike in appearance, both bald, with bunches of crisp hair above their ears, arguing the presence of some Negro blood. Only Pedro was smaller than the general, more delicate altogether, with an ape-like faculty for imitating all the outward signs of refinement and distinction, and with a parrot-like talent for languages. Both brothers had received some elementary instruction by the munificence of a great European traveller, to whom their father had been a body servant during his journeys in the interior of the country. In General Montero's case, it enabled him to rise from the ranks. Pedrito, the younger, incorrigibly lazy and slovenly, had drifted aimlessly from one coast town to another, hanging about counting houses, attaching himself to strangers as a sort of valet de place, picking up an easy and disreputable living. His ability to read did nothing for him but fill his head with absurd visions. His actions were usually determined by motives so improbable in themselves as to escape the penetration of a rational person. Thus, at first sight, the agent of the good concession in Santa Marta had credited him with the possession of sane views, and even with a restraining power over the general's everlastingly discontented vanity. It could never have entered his head that Pedrito Montero, lackey or inferior scribe, lodged in the garrets of the various Parisian hotels where the Costaguana legation used to shelter its diplomatic dignity, had been devouring the lighter sort of historical works in the French language, such, for instance, as the books of Imbert, the Saint-Amand upon the Second Empire. But Pedrito had been struck by the splendor of a brilliant court, and had conceived the idea of an existence for himself where, like the Duc de Morny, he would associate the command of every pleasure with the conduct of political affairs, and enjoy power supremely in every way. Nobody could have guessed that. And yet this was one of the immediate causes of the Monterist revolution. This will appear less credible by the reflection that the fundamental causes were the same as ever, rooted in the political immaturity of the people, in the indolence of the upper classes, and the mental darkness of the lower. Pedrito Montero saw in the elevation of his brother the road wide open to his wildest imaginings. This was what made the Monterist pronunciamiento so unpreventable. The general himself probably could have been bought off, pacified with flatteries, dispatched on a diplomatic mission to Europe. It was his brother who had egged him on from first to last. He wanted to become the most brilliant statesman of South America. He did not desire supreme power. He would have been afraid of its labor and risk, in fact. Before all, Pedrito Montero, taught by this European experience, meant to acquire a serious fortune for himself. With this object in view, he obtained from his brother, on the very morrow of the successful battle, the permission to push on over the mountains and take possession of Sulaco. Sulaco was the land of future prosperity, the chosen land of material progress, the only province in the Republic of interest to European capitalists. Pedrito Montero, following the example of the Duc de Morny, meant to have his share of this prosperity. This is what he meant literally. Now his brother was master of the country, whether as president, dictator, or even as emperor. Why not as an emperor? He meant to demand a share in every enterprise. In railways, in mines, in sugar estates, in cotton mills, in land companies, in each and every undertaking as the price of his protection. The desire to be on the spot early was the real cause of the celebrated ride over the mountains with some 200 llaneros, an enterprise of which the dangers had not appeared at first clearly to his impatience. Coming from a series of victories, it seemed to him that a Montero had only to appear to be master of the situation. This illusion had betrayed him into a rashness of which he was becoming aware. As he rode at the head of his llaneros, he regretted that there were so few of them. The enthusiasm of the populace reassured him. They yelled, "Viva Montero! Viva Pedrito!" In order to make them still more enthusiastic, and from the natural pleasure he had in dissembling, he dropped the reins of his horse's neck, and with a tremendous effect of familiarity and confidence, slipped his hands under the arms of Señores Fuentes and Gamacho. In that posture, with a rag-town mozo holding his horse by the bridle, he rode triumphantly across the plaza to the door of the Intendencia. Its old gloomy walls seemed to shake in the acclamations that rent the air and covered the crashing peals of the cathedral bells. Pedro Montero, the brother of the general, dismounted into a shouting and perspiring throng of enthusiasts whom the rag nationals were pushing back fiercely. Ascending a few steps, he surveyed the large crowd gaping at him at the bullet-speckled walls of the houses opposite, lightly veiled by the sunny haze of dust. The word "Pourvenir," in immense black capitals, alternating with broken windows, stared at him across the vast space, and he thought with the delight of the hour of vengeance because he was very sure of laying his hands upon Decoud. On his left hand, Gamacho, big and hot, wiping his hairy wet face, uncovered a set of yellow fangs in a grin of stupid hilarity. On his right, Senor Fuentes, small and lean, looked on with compressed lips. The crowd stared literally open-mouthed, lost in eager stillness, as though they had expected the great guerrillero, the famous Pedrito, to begin scattering at once some sort of visible largesse. What he began was a speech. He began it with the shouted word "Citizens," which reached even those in the middle of the plaza. Afterwards, the greater part of the citizens remained fascinated by the orator's action alone. His tiptoeing, the arms flung above his head, with the fists clenched, a hand laid flat upon the heart, the silver gleam of rolling eyes, the sweeping, pointing, embracing gestures, a hand laid familiarly on Gamacho's shoulder, a hand waved formally towards the little black-coated person of Senor Fuentes, advocate and politician and a true friend of the people. The vivas of those nearest to the orator bursting out suddenly propagated themselves irregularly to the confines of the crowd, like flames running over dry grass, and expired in the opening of the streets. In the intervals, over the swarming plaza brooded a heavy silence, in which the mouth of the orator went on opening and shouting at detached phrases, "The happiness of the people," "Sons of the country," "The entire world," "El mundo entero," reached even the packed streets of the cathedral with a feeble clear ring, thin as the buzzing of a mosquito. But the orator struck his breast. He seemed to prance between his two supporters. It was the supreme effort of his peroration. Then the two smaller figures disappeared from the public gaze, and the enormous Gamacho, left alone, advanced, raising his hat high above his head. Then he covered himself proudly and yelled out, "Ciudadanos!" A dull roar greeted Senor Gamacho, ex-peddler of the Campo, Commandante of the National Guards. Upstairs, Pedrito Montero walked about rapidly from one wrecked room of the Intendencia to another, snarling incessantly. "What stupidity! What destruction!" Senor Fuentes, following, would relax his taciturn disposition to murmur, "It is all the work of Gamacho and his nationals," and then, inclining his head on his left shoulder, would press together his lips so firmly that a little hollow would appear at each corner. He had his nomination for political chief of the town in his pocket, and was all impatience to enter upon his functions. In the long audience room, with its tall mirrors all starred by stones, the hangings torn down, and the canopy over the platform at the upper end pulled to pieces, the vast, deep muttering of the crowd and the howling voice of Gamacho speaking just below reached them through the shutters as they stood idly in dimness and desolation. "The brute," observed His Excellency Don Pedro Montero through clenched teeth. "We must contrive as quickly as possible to send him and his nationals out there to fight Hernandez." The new Jefe Politico only jerked his head sideways and took a puff at his cigarette in sign of his agreement with this method of forwarding the town of Gamacho in his inconvenient rabble. Pedrito Montero looked with disgust at the absolutely bare floor and at the belt of heavy gilt picture frames running round the room, out of which the remnants of torn and slashed canvases fluttered like dingy rags. "We are not barbarians," he said. This was what said His Excellency, the popular Pedrito, the guerrillero skilled in the art of laying ambushes, charged by his brother at his own demand with the organization of Sulaco on democratic principles. The night before, during the consultation with his partisans who had come out to meet him in Rincon, he had opened his intentions to Senor Fuentes. "We shall organize a popular vote, by yes or no, confiding the destinies of our beloved country to the wisdom and valiance of my heroic brother, the invincible general. A plebiscite. Do you understand?" And Senor Fuentes, puffing out his leathery cheeks, had inclined his head slightly to the left, letting a thin bluish jet of smoke escape through his pursed lips. He had understood. His Excellency was exasperated at this devastation. Not a single chair, table, sofa, etagere, or console had been left in the state rooms of the Intendencia. His Excellency, though twitching all over with rage, was restrained from bursting into violence by a sense of his remoteness and isolation. His heroic brother was very far away. Meantime, how was he going to take his siesta? He had expected to find comfort and luxury in the Intendencia after a year of hard camp life, ending with the hardships and privations of the daring dash upon Sulaco, upon the province which was worth more in wealth and influence than all the rest of the Republic's territory. He would get even with Gamacho by and by. And Senor Gamacho's oration, delectable to popular ears, went on in the heat and glare of the plaza like the uncouth howlings of an inferior sort of devil cast into a white-hot furnace. Every moment he had to wipe his streaming face with his bare forearm. He had flung off his coat, and had turned up the sleeves of his shirt high above the elbows. But he kept on his head a large cocked hat with white plumes. His ingenuousness cherished the sign of his rank as Commandante of the National Guards. Approving and grave murmurs greeted his periods. His opinion was that war should be declared at once against France, England, Germany, and the United States, who, by introducing railways, mining, enterprises, colonization, and under such other shallow pretenses, aimed at robbing poor people of their lands, and with the help of these Goths and paralytics, the aristocrats would convert them into toiling and miserable slaves. And the leperos, flinging about the corners of their dirty white mantas, yelled their approbation. General Montero, Gamacho, hauled with conviction, was the only man equal to the patriotic task. They assented to that too. The morning was wearing on. There were already signs of disruption, currents, and eddies in the crowd. Some were seeking the shade of the walls and under the trees of the Alameda. Horsemen spurred through, shouting. Groups of sombreros set level on heads against the vertical sun were drifting away into the streets, where the open doors of pulperias revealed an enticing gloom, resounding with the gentle tinkling of guitars. The National Guards were thinking of siesta, and the eloquence of Camacho, their chief, was exhausted. Later on, when the cooler hours of the afternoon they tried to assemble again for further consideration of public affairs, detachments of Montero's cavalry camped on the Alameda charged them with a parley at speed, with long lances levelled at their flying backs as far as the ends of the streets. The National Guards of Sulaco were surprised by this proceeding, but they were not indignant. No Costaguanero had ever learned to question the eccentricities of a military force. They were part of their natural order of things. This must be, they concluded, some kind of administrative measure, no doubt. But the motive of it escaped their unaided intelligence, and their chief and orator Gamacho, commandant of the National Guard, was lying drunk and asleep in the bosom of his family. His bare feet were upturned in the shadows repulsively, in the manner of a corpse. His eloquent mouth had dropped open. His youngest daughter, scratching her head with one hand, with the other waved a green bow over his scorched and peeling face. End of Part 3, Chapter 5 of Nostromo. Chapter 6 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3, The Lighthouse. Chapter 6. The declining sun had shifted the shadows from west to east among the houses of the town. It had shifted them upon the whole extent of the immense campo, with the white walls of its haciendas and the knolls dominating the green distances, with its grass-thatched ranches crouching in the folds of ground by the banks of streams, with the dark islands of clustered trees on a clear sea of grass, and the precipitous range of the Cordillera immense and motionless, emerging from the billows of the lower forests like the barren coast of a land of giants. The sunset rays striking the snow slope of Ribierist from afar gave it an air of rosy youth, while the serrated mass of distant peaks remained black as if calcined in the fiery radiance. The undulating surface of the forest seemed powdered with pale gold dust, and away there, beyond Rincon, hidden from the town of two wooden spurs, the rocks of the San Tome gorge, with the flat wall of the mountain itself crowned by gigantic ferns, took on warm tones of brown and yellow, with red rusky streaks, and the dark green clumps of bushes rooted in crevices. From the plain, the stamp sheds and the houses of the mine appeared dark and small, high up, like the nests of birds clustered on the ledges of a cliff. The zigzag paths resembled faint tracings stretched on the wall of a cyclopean blockhouse. To the two serenos of the mine on patrol duty, strolling, carbine in hand and watchful eye, in the shade of the trees lining the stream near the bridge, Don Pepe, descending the path from the upper plateau, appeared no bigger than a large beetle. With his air of aimless, insect-like going to and fro upon the face of the rock, Don Pepe's figure kept on descending steadily, and when near the bottom, sank at last behind the roofs of storehouses, forges, and workshops. For a time the pair of serenos strolled back and forth before the bridge, on which they had stopped, a horseman holding a large white envelope in his hand. Then Don Pepe, emerging in the village street from amongst the houses, noticed Don Nostro from the frontier bridge approach, striding in wide dark trousers tucked into boots, and a white linen jacket, sabre at his side, and revolver at his belt. In this disturbed time nothing could find the Señor Gobernador with his boots off, as the saying is. At a slight note from one of the serenos, the man, a messenger from the town, dismounted, and crossed the bridge, leading his horse by the bridle. Don Pepe received the letter from his other hand, slapped his left side and his hips in succession, feeling for his spectacle case. After settling the heavy silver-mounted affair astride his nose and adjusting it carefully behind his ears, he opened the envelope, holding it up at about a foot in front of his eyes. The paper he pulled out contained some 3 lines of writing. He looked at them for a long time. His great moustache moved slightly up and down, and the wrinkles, radiating at the corners of his eyes, ran together. He nodded serenely. "Bueno," he said. There is no answer. Then, in his quiet, kindly way, he engaged in a cautious conversation with the man who was willing to talk cheerily, as if something lucky had happened to him recently. He had seen from a distance Sotillo's infantry camped along the shore of the harbour on each side of the custom house. They had done no damage to the buildings. The foreigners of the railway remained shut up within the yards. They were no longer anxious to shoot poor people. He cursed the foreigners. Then he reported Montero's entry and the rumours of the town. The poor were going to be made rich now. That was very good. More he did not know. And breaking into propitiatory smiles, he intimated that he was hungry and thirsty. The old major directed him to go to the alcalde of the first village. The man rode off, and Don Pepe, striding slowly in the direction of the little wooden belfry, looked over a hedge into a little garden, and saw Father Roman sitting in a white hammock slung between 2 orange trees in front of the presbytery. An enormous tamarind shaded with its dark foliage the whole white frame house. A young Indian girl, with long hair, big eyes, and small hands and feet, carried out a wooden chair, while a thin old woman, crabbed and vigilant, watched her all the time from the veranda. Don Pepe sat down in the chair and lighted a cigar. The priest drew in an immense quantity of snuff out of the hollow of his palm. On his reddish-brown face, worn, hollowed as if crumbled, the eyes, fresh and candid, sparkled like 2 black diamonds. Don Pepe, in a mild and humorous voice, informed Father Roman that Pedrito Montero, by the hand of Senor Fuentes, had asked him on what terms he would surrender the mine in proper working order to a legally constituted commission of patriotic citizens, escorted by a small military force. The priest cast his eyes up to heaven. However, Don Pepe continued, the mozo who brought the letter said that Don Carlos Gould was alive and so far unmolested. Father Roman expressed in a few words his thankfulness of hearing of the Senor Administrador's safety. The hour of oration had gone by the silvery ringing of a bell in the little belfry. The belt of forest closing the entrance of the valley stood like a screen between the low sun and the street of the village. At the other end of the rocky gorge, between the walls of basalt and granite, a forest-clad mountain, hiding all the range from the San Tome dwellers, rose steeply, lighted up and leafy to the very top. 3 small rosy clouds hung motionless overhead in the great depth of blue. Knots of people sat in the street between the wattled huts. Before the casa of the alcalde, the foreman of the night shift, already assembled to lead their men, squatted on the ground in a circle of leather skull caps, and, bowing their bronze backs, were passing round the gourd of mate. The mozo from the town, having fastened his horse to a wooden post before the door, was telling them the news of Sulaco as the blackened gourd of the decoction passed from hand to hand. The grave alcalde himself, in a white waistcloth and a flowered chintz gown with sleeves, open wide upon his naked stout person with an effect of a gaudy bathing robe, stood by, wearing a rough beaver hat at the back of his head, and grasping a tall staff with a silver knob in his hand. This insignia of his dignity had been conferred upon him by the administration of the mine, the fountain of honour, of prosperity and peace. He had been one of the first immigrants into this valley. His sons and sons-in-law worked within the mountain, which seemed with its treasures to pour down the thundering ore shoots of the upper mesa, the gifts of well-being, security, and justice upon the toilers. He listened to the news from the town with curiosity and indifference, as if concerning another world than his own. And it was true that they appeared to him so. In a very few years, the sense of belonging to a powerful organization had been developed in these harassed, half-wild Indians. They were proud of and attached to the mine. It had secured their confidence and belief. They invested it with a protecting and invincible virtue as though it were a fetish made by their own hands, for they were ignorant, and in other respects did not differ appreciably from the rest of mankind, which puts infinite trust in its own creations. It never entered the alcalde's head that the mine could fail in its protection and force. Politics were good enough for the people of the town and the campo. His yellow, round face, with wide nostrils, and motionless in expression, resembled a fierce full moon. He listened to the excited vapourings of the mozo without misgivings, without surprise, without any active sentiment whatever. Padre Roman sat dejectedly balancing himself, his feet just touching the ground, his hands gripping the edge of the hammock. With less confidence, but as ignorant as his flock, he asked the major what he did think was going to happen now. Don Pepe, bolt upright in the chair, folded with hands peacefully on the hilt of his sword, standing perpendicular between his thighs, and answered that he did not know. The mine could be defended against any force likely to be sent to take possession. On the other hand, from the arid character of the valley, when the regular supplies from the campo had been cut off, the population of the three villages could be starved into submission. Don Pepe exposed these contingencies with serenity to Father Roman, who, as an old campaigner, was able to understand the reasoning of a military man. They talked with simplicity and directness. Father Roman was saddened at the idea of his flock being scattered or else enslaved. He had no illusions as to their fate, not from penetration, but from long experience of political atrocities which seemed to him fatal and unavoidable in the life of a state. The working of the usual public institutions presented itself to him most distinctly as a series of calamities overtaking private individuals and flowing logically from each other through hate, revenge, folly, and rapacity, as though they had been part of a divine dispensation. Father Roman's clear-sightedness was served by an uninformed intelligence, but his heart, preserving its tenderness amongst scenes of carnage, spoliation, and violence, abhorred these calamities the more as his association with the victims was closer. He entertained towards the Indians of the valley feelings of paternal scorn. He had been marrying, baptizing, confessing, absolving, and burying the workers of the Santum mine with dignity and unction for 5 years or more, and he believed in the sacredness of these ministrations, which made them his own in a spiritual sense. They were dear to his sacerdotal supremacy. Mrs. Gould's earnest interest in the concerns of these people enhanced their importance in the priest's eyes, because it really augmented his own. When talking over with her the innumerable Marias and Brigidas of the villages, he felt his own humanity expand. Padre Roman was incapable of fanaticism to an almost reprehensible degree. The English senora was evidently a heretic, but at the same time she seemed to him wonderful and angelic. Whatever that confused state of his feelings occurred to him, while strolling, for instance, his breviary under his arm, in the wide shade of a tamarind, he would stop short to inhale with a strong snuffing nose a large quantity of snuff, and shake his head profoundly. At the thought of what might befall the illustrious senora presently, he became gradually overcome with dismay. He voiced it in an agitated murmur. Even Don Pepe lost his serenity for a moment. He leaned forward stiffly. "Listen, Padre. The very fact that those thieving macaques in Sulaco are trying to find out the price of my honor proves that Senor Don Carlos and all in the Casa Gould are safe. As to my honor, that is also safe, as every man, woman, and child knows. But the Negro liberals who have snatched the town by surprise do not know that. Bueno, let them sit and wait. While they wait, they can do no harm." And he regained his composure. He regained it easily because whatever happened, his honor of an old officer of Paz was safe. He had promised Charles Gould that at the approach of an armed force he would defend the gorge just long enough to give himself time to destroy scientifically the whole plant, buildings, and workshops of the mine with heavy charges of dynamite, block with ruins the main tunnel, break down the pathways, blow out the dam of the water power, shatter the famous Gould concession into fragments, flying sky high out of a horrified world. The mine had got hold of Charles Gould with a grip as deadly as ever it had laid upon his father. But this extreme resolution had seemed to Don Pepe the most natural thing in the world. His measures had been taken with judgment. Everything was prepared with a careful completeness. And Don Pepe folded his hands pacifically on his sword hilt and nodded at the priest. In his excitement, Father Roman had flung snuff in handfuls at his face, and, all besmeared with tobacco, round eye, and beside himself, had got out of the hammock to walk about, uttering exclamations. Don Pepe stroked his grey and pendant moustache, whose fine ends hung far below the clean-cut line of his jaw, and spoke with a conscious pride in his reputation. "So, Padre, I don't know what will happen, but I know that as long as I am here Don Carlos can speak to the macaque, Pedrito Montero, and threaten the destruction of the mine with perfect assurance that he will be taken seriously, for people know me." He began to turn the cigar in his lips, and a little nervously, and went on. "But that is talk, good for the politicos. I am a military man. I do not know what might happen, but I know what ought to be done. The mine should march upon the town with guns, axes, knives tied up to sticks. Por Dios! That is what should be done. Only—" His folded hands twitched on the hilt. The cigar turned faster in the corner of his lips. "And who should I lead but I? Unfortunately, observe, I have given my word of honor to Don Carlos not to let the mine fall into the hands of these thieves. In war, you know this, Padre, the fate of battles is uncertain, and who could I have here to act for me in case of defeat? The explosives are ready, but it would require a man of high honor, of intelligence, of judgment, of courage, to carry out the prepared destruction. Somebody I can trust with my honor as I can trust myself. Another old officer of Paez, for instance. Or perhaps one of Paez's old chaplains would do." He got up, long, lank, upright, hard, with his martial moustache, and the bony structure of his face, from which the glance of the sunken eye seemed to transfix the priest, who stood still, an empty wooden snuff-box held upside down in his hand, and glared back, speechless, at the governor of the mine. End of Part 3, Chapter 6 of Nostromo. Chapter 7 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3, The Lighthouse. Chapter 7. At about that time, in the Intendencia of Sulaco, Charles Gould was assuring Pedrito Montero, who had sent a request for his presence there, that he would never let the mine pass out of his hands for the profit of a government who had robbed him of it. The Gould concession could not be resumed. His father had not desired it. The son would never surrender it. He would never surrender it alive. And once dead, where was the power capable of resuscitating such an enterprise of all its vigour and wealth out of the ashes and ruin of destruction? There was no such power in the country. And where was the skill and capital abroad that would condescend to touch such an ill-omened corpse? Charles Gould talked in the impassive tone which had for many years served to conceal his anger and contempt. He suffered. He was disgusted with what he had to say. It was too much like heroics. In him the strictly practical instinct was in profound discord with the almost mystic view he took of his right. The Gould concession was symbolic of abstract justice. Let the heavens fall. But since the San Tome mine had developed into world-wide fame, his threat had enough force and effectiveness to reach the rudimentary intelligence of Pedro Montero, wrapped up as it was in the futilities of historical anecdotes. The Gould concession was a serious asset in the country's finance, and, what was more, in the private budgets of many officials as well. It was traditional. It was known. It was said. It was credible. Every Minister of Interior drew a salary from the San Tome mine. It was natural. And Pedrito intended to be Minister of the Interior and President of the Council in his brother's government. The Duc de Morny had occupied those high posts during the Second French Empire with conspicuous advantage to himself. A table, a chair, a wooden bedstead had been procured for His Excellency, who, after a short siesta, rendered absolutely necessary by the labours and the pomps of his entry into Sulaco, had been getting hold of the administrative machine by making appointments, giving orders, and signing proclamations. Along with Charles Gould in the audience room, His Excellency managed with his well-known skill to conceal his annoyance and consternation. He had begun at first to talk loftily of confiscation, but the want of all proper feeling and mobility in the Señor Administrador's features ended by affecting adversely his power of masterful expression. Charles Gould had repeated, "The government can certainly bring about the destruction of the San Tome mine if it likes, but without me it can do nothing else." It was an alarming pronouncement, and well calculated to hurt the sensibilities of a politician whose mind is bent upon the spoils of victory. And Charles Gould said also that the destruction of the San Tome mine would cause the ruin of other undertakings, the withdrawal of European capital, the withholding most probably of the last installment of the foreign loan. That stony fiend of a man said all these things, which were accessible to His Excellency's intelligence, in a cold-blooded manner which made one shudder. A long course of reading historical works, light and gossipy in tone, carried out in garrets of Parisian hotels, sprawling on an untidy bed, to the neglect of his duties, menial or otherwise, had affected the manners of Pedro Montero. He had seen around him the splendor of the old Intendencia, the magnificent hangings, the gilt furniture ranked along the walls. He had stood upon a day on a noble square of red carpet. He would have probably been very dangerous from a sense of success and elevation. But in this sacked and devastated residence, with the three pieces of common furniture huddled up in the middle of a vast apartment, Pedrito's imagination was subdued by a feeling of insecurity and impermanence. That feeling, and the firm attitude of Charles Gould, who had not once, so far, pronounced the word excellency, diminished him in his own eyes. He assumed the tone of an enlightened man of the world, and begged Charles Gould to dismiss from his mind every cause for alarm. He was now conversing, he reminded him, with the brother of the master of the country, charged with a reorganizing mission. The trusted brother of the master of the country, he repeated. Nothing was further from the thoughts of that wise and patriotic hero than ideas of destruction. I entreat you, Don Carlos, not to give way to your anti-democratic prejudices, he cried, in a burst of condescending effusion. Pedrito Montero surprised one at first sight by the vast development of his bald forehead, a shiny yellow expanse between the crinkly, coal-black tufts of hair without any lustre, the engaging form of his mouth, and an unexpectedly cultivated voice. But his eyes, very glistening as if freshly painted on each side of his hooked nose, had a round, hopeless, bird-like stare when opened fully. Now, however, he narrowed them agreeably, throwing his square chin up, and speaking with closed teeth slightly through the nose, with what he imagined to be the manner of a grand seigneur. In that attitude he declared suddenly that the highest expression of democracy was Caesarism, the imperial rule based upon the direct popular vote. Caesarism was conservative. It was strong. It recognized the legitimate needs of democracy, which requires orders, titles, and distinctions. They would be showered upon the serving man. Caesarism was peace. It was progressive. It secured the prosperity of a country. Pedrito Montero was carried away. Look at what the Second Empire had done for France. It was a regime which delighted to honor men of Don Carlos's stamp. The Second Empire fell, but that was because its chief was devoid of that military genius which had raised General Montero to the pinnacle of fame and glory. Pedrito elevated his hand jerkily to help the idea of pinnacle, of fame. We shall have many talks yet. We shall understand each other thoroughly, Don Carlos, he cried in a tone of fellowship. Republicanism had done its work. Imperial democracy was the power of the future. Pedrito, the guerrillero, showing his hand, lowered his voice forcibly. A man singled out by his fellow citizens for the honorable nickname of El Rey de Sulaco could not but receive a full recognition from an imperial democracy as a great captain of industry and a person of weighty counsel, whose popular designation could be soon replaced by a more solid title. Eh, Don Carlos? No. What do you say? Conde de Sulaco, eh? Or Marquis? He ceased. The air was cool on the plaza, where a patrol of cavalry rode round and round without penetrating into the streets, which resounded with shouts and the strumming of guitars issuing from the open doors of pulperias. The orders were not to interfere with the enjoyment of the people. And above the roofs, next to the perpendicular lines of the cathedral towers, the snowy curve of Higuerota blocked a large space of darkening blue sky before the windows of the Intendencia. After a time, Pedrito Montero, thrusting his hand in the bosom of his coat, bowed his head with a slow dignity. The audience was over. Charles Gould, on going out, passed his hand over his forehead as if to disperse the mists of an oppressive dream, whose grotesque extravagance leaves behind a subtle sense of bodily danger and intellectual decay. In the passage and on the staircases of the old palace, Montero's troopers lounged about insolently, smoking and making way for no one. The clanking of sabres and spurs resounded all over the building. Three silent groups of civilians in severe black waited in the main gallery, formal and helpless, a little huddled up, each keeping apart from the others, as if in the exercise of a public duty they had been overcome by a desire to shun the notice of every eye. These were the deputations waiting for their audience. The one from the provincial assembly, more restless and uneasy in his corporate expression, was overtopped by the big face of Don Juste Lopez, soft and wise, with prominent eyelids and wreathed in impenetrable solemnity as if in a dense cloud. The president of the Provincial Assembly, coming bravely to save the last shred of parliamentary institutions on the English model, averted his eyes from the administrador of the San Tome mine as a dignified rebuke of his little faith in that only saving principle. The mournful severity of that reproof did not affect Charles Gould, but he was sensible to the glances of the others directed upon him without reproach, as if only to read their own fate upon his face. All of them had talked, shouted, and declaimed in the great sala of the Casa Gould. The feeling of compassion for those men, struck with a strange impotence in the toils of moral degradation, did not induce him to make a sign. He suffered from his fellowship in evil with them too much. He crossed the plaza unmolested. The Amarilla Club was full of festive ragamuffins. Their frowsy heads protruded from every window, and from within came drunken shouts, the trumping of feet, and the twanging of harps. Broken bottles strewed the pavement below. Charles Gould found the doctor still in his house. Dr. Monygham came away from the crack in the shutter through which he had been watching the street. "Ah, you're back at last," he said in a tone of relief. "I have been telling Mrs. Gould that you were perfectly safe, but I was not by any means certain that the fellow would have let you go." "Neither was I," confessed Charles Gould, laying his hat on the table. "You will have to take action." The silence of Charles Gould seemed to admit that this was the only course. This was as far as Charles Gould was accustomed to go towards expressing his intentions. "I hope you did not warn Montero of what you mean to do," the doctor said anxiously. "I tried to make him see that the existence of the mine was bound up with my personal safety," continued Charles Gould, looking away from the doctor, and fixing his eyes upon the water-colour sketch upon the wall. "He believed you?" the doctor asked eagerly. "God knows," said Charles Gould. "I owe it to my wife to say that much. He is well enough informed. He knows that I have Don Pepe there. Fuentes must have told him. They know that the old major is perfectly capable of blowing up the San Tome mine without hesitation or compunction. Had it not been for that, I don't think I had left the Intendencia a free man. He would blow everything up from loyalty and from hate. From hate of these liberals, as they call themselves. Liberals! The words one knows so well have a nightmarish meaning in this country. Liberty, democracy, patriotism, government, all of them have a flavour of folly and murder. Haven't they, doctor? I alone can't restrain Don Pepe. If they were to do away with me, nothing could prevent him." "They will try to tamper with him," the doctor suggested thoughtfully. "It is very possible," Charles Gould said very low, as if speaking to himself, and still gazing at the sketch of the San Tome gorge upon the wall. "Yes, I expect they will try that." Charles Gould looked for the first time at the doctor. "It would give me time," he added. "Exactly," said Dr. Monygham, suppressing his excitement. "Especially if Don Pepe behaves diplomatically. Why shouldn't he give them some hope of success? Eh? Otherwise, you wouldn't gain so much time. Couldn't he be instructed to—" Charles Gould, looking at the doctor steadily, shook his head, but the doctor continued with a certain amount of fire. "Yes, to enter into negotiations for the surrender of the mine. It is a good notion. You would mature your plan. Of course, I don't ask what it is. I don't want to know. I would refuse to listen to you if you tried to tell me. I am not fearful confidences." "What nonsense!" muttered Charles Gould with displeasure. He disapproved of the doctor's sensitiveness about that far-off episode of his life. So much memory shocked Charles Gould. It was like morbidness. And again he shook his head. He refused to tamper with the open rectitude of Don Pepe's conduct, both from taste and from policy. Instructions would have to be either verbal or in writing. In either case, they ran the risk of being intercepted. It was by no means certain that a messenger could reach the mine, and besides, there was no one to send. It was on the tip of Charles' tongue to say that only the late capataz de cargadores could have been employed with some chance of success and the certitude of discretion. But he did not say that. He pointed out to the doctor that it would have been bad policy. Directly Don Pepe let it be supposed that he could be bought over, the administrador's personal safety and the safety of his friends would become endangered. For there would be, then, no reason for moderation. The incorruptibility of Don Pepe was the essential and restraining fact. The doctor hung his head and admitted that, in a way, it was so. He couldn't deny to himself that the reasoning was sound enough. Don Pepe's usefulness consisted in his unstained character. As to his own usefulness, he reflected bitterly, it was also his own character. He declared to Charles Gould that he had the means of keeping Sotillo from joining his forces with Montero, at least for the present. If you had had all this silver here, the doctor said, or even if it had been known to be at the mine, you could have bribed Sotillo to throw off his recent Monterism. You could have induced him either to go away in his steamer or even to join you. Certainly not that last, Charles Gould declared firmly. What could one do with a man like that afterwards? Tell me, doctor. The silver is gone, and I am glad of it. It would have been an immediate and strong temptation. The scramble for that visible plunder would have precipitated a disastrous ending. I would have had to defend it too. I am glad we've removed it, even if it is lost. It would have been a danger and a curse. Perhaps he is right, the doctor an hour later said hurriedly to Mrs. Gould, whom he met in the corridor. The thing is done, and the shadow of the treasure might do just as well as the substance. Let me try to serve you the whole extent of my evil reputation. I am off now to play my game of betrayal with Sotillo and keep him off the town. She put up both her hands impulsively. Dr. Monygham, you are running a terrible risk, she whispered, averting from his face her eyes, full of tears, for a short glance at the door of her husband's room. She pressed both his hands, and the doctor stood as if rooted to the spot, looking down at her, and trying to twist his lips into a smile. "Oh, I know you will defend my memory," he uttered at last, and ran tottering down the stairs across the patio and out of the house. In the street he kept up a great pace with his smart hobbling walk, a case of instruments under his arm. He was known for being loco. Nobody interfered with him. From under the seaward gate, across the dusty, arid pane, interspersed with low bushes, he saw, more than a mile away, the ugly enormity of the custom house and the 2 or 3 other buildings which at that time constituted the seaport of Sulaco. Far away to the south, groves of palm trees edged the curve of the harbour shore. The distant peaks of the Cordillera had lost their identity of clear-cut shapes in the steadily deepening blue of the eastern sky. The doctor walked briskly. A darkling shadow seemed to fall upon him from the zenith. The sun had set. For a time the snows of Higuerota continued to glow with the reflected glory of the west. The doctor, holding a straight course for the custom house, appeared lonely, hopping amongst the dark bushes like a tall bird with a broken wing. Tints of purple, gold, and crimson were mirrored in the clear water of the harbour. A long tongue of land, straight as a wall, with the grass-grown ruins of the fort making a sort of rounded green mound, plainly visible from the inner shore, closed its circuit, while beyond the placid gulf repeated those splendours of colouring on a greater scale and with a more sombre magnificence. The great mass of cloud filling the head of the gulf had long red smears amongst its convoluted folds of grey and black, as of a floating mantle stained with blood. The 3 Isabels, overshadowed and clear-cut in the great smoothness confounding the sea and sky, appeared suspended, purple-black in the air. The little wavelets seemed to be tossing tiny red sparks upon the sandy beaches. The glassy bands of water along the horizon gave out a fiery red glow, as if fire and water had been mingled together in the vast bed of the ocean. At last the conflagration of sea and sky, lying embraced and still in a flaming contact upon the edge of the world, went out. The red sparks on the water vanished together with the stains of blood in the black mantle draping the sombre head of the placid gulf. A sudden breeze sprang up and died out after rustling heavily the growth of bushes on the ruined earthwork of the fort. Nostromo woke up from a 14 hours' sleep, and arose full length from his lair in the long grass. He stood knee-deep amongst the whispering undulations of the green blades with the lost air of a man just born into the world. Handsome, robust, and supple, he threw back his head, flung his arms open, and stretched himself with a slow twist of the waist and a leisurely growling yawn of white teeth, as natural and free from evil in the moment of waking as a magnificent and unconscious wild beast. Then, in the suddenly steady glance, fixed upon nothing from under a thoughtful frown, appeared the man. End of Part 3, Chapter 7 of Nostromo. Part 3, Chapter 8, Part 1 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3, The Lighthouse. Chapter 8, Part 1. After landing from his swim, Nostromo had scrambled up, all dripping, into the main quadrangle of the old fort. And there, amongst ruined bits of walls and rotting remnants of roofs and sheds, he had slept in the shadow of the mountains, in the white blaze of noon, in the stillness and solitude of that overgrown piece of land between the oval of the harbour and the spacious semicircle of the gulf. He lay as if dead. A Rey Zamurano, appearing like a tiny black speck in the blue, stooped, circling prudently, with a stealthiness of flight startling in a bird of that grey size. The shadow of his pearly white body, of his black-tipped wings, fell on the grass no more silently than he alighted himself on a hillock of rubbish within 3 yards of the man lying as still as a corpse. The bird stretched his bare neck, craned his bald head, loathsome in the brilliance of varied colouring, with an air of voracious anxiety towards the promising stillness of that prostrate body. Then, sinking his head deeply into his soft plumage, he settled himself to wait. The first thing upon which Nostromo's eyes fell on waking was this patient watcher for the signs of death and corruption. When the man got up, the vulture hopped away in great sidelong fluttering jumps. He lingered for a while, morose and reluctant, before he rose, circling noiselessly, with a sinister drop of beak and claws. Long after he had vanished, Nostromo, lifting his eyes up to the sky, muttered, "I am not dead yet." The capataz of the Sulaco cargadores had lived in splendour and publicity up to the very moment, as it were, when he took charge of the lighter containing the treasure of silver ingots. The last act he had performed in Sulaco was in complete harmony with his vanity, and as such perfectly genuine. He had given his last dollar to an old woman moaning with the grief and fatigue of a dismal search under the arch of the ancient gate. Performed in obscurity and without witnesses, it had still the characteristics of splendour and publicity, and was in strict keeping with his reputation. But this awakening in solitude, except for the watchful vulture amongst the ruins of the fort, had no such characteristics. His first confused feeling was exactly this, that it was not in keeping. It was more like the end of things. The necessity of living, concealed somehow, for God knows how long, which assailed him on his return to consciousness, made everything that had gone before for years appear vain and foolish, like a flattering dream come suddenly to an end. He climbed the crumbling slope of the rampart, and putting aside the bushes, looked upon the harbour. He saw a couple of ships at anchor upon the sheet of water reflecting the last gleams of light, and Sotillo's steamer moored to the jetty. And behind the pale long front of the custom house there appeared the extent of the town like a grove of thick timber on the plain, with a gateway in front, and the cupolas, towers, and miradors rising above the trees, all dark, as if surrendered already to the night. The thought that it was no longer open to him to ride through the streets, recognized by everyone, great and little, as he used to do every evening on his way to play monte in the posada of the Mexican Domingo, or to sit in the place of honour, listening to songs and looking at dances, made it appear to him as a town that had no existence. For a long time he gazed on, then let the parted bushes spring back, and crossing over to the other side of the fort, surveyed the vast emptiness of the great gulf. The Isabels stood out heavily upon the narrow and long band of red in the west, which gleamed low between their black shapes, and the capataz thought of Decoud alone there with the treasure. That man was the only one who cared whether he fell into the hands of the Monterists or not, the capataz reflected bitterly, and that merely would be an anxiety for his own sake. As to the rest, they neither knew nor cared. What he had heard Giorgio Viola say once was very true. Kings, ministers, aristocrats, the rich in general, kept the people in poverty and subjection. They kept them as they kept dogs, to fight and hunt for their service. The darkness of the sky had descended to the line of the horizon, enveloping the whole gulf, the islets, and the lover of Antonia alone with the treasure on the Great Isabel. The capataz, turning his back on these things invisible and existing, sat down and took his face between his fists. He felt the pinch of poverty for the first time in his life. To defend himself without money, after a run of bad luck at monte in the low, smoky room of Domingo's posada, where the fraternity of cargadores gambled, sang, and danced of an evening, to remain with empty pockets after a burst of public generosity to some pine doral girl or other for whom he did not care, had none of the humiliation of destitution. He remained rich in glory and reputation, but since it was no longer possible for him to parade the streets of the town and be hailed with respect in the usual haunts of his leisure, this sailor felt himself destitute indeed. His mouth was dry. It was dry with heavy sleep and extremely anxious thinking, as it had never been dry before. It might be said that Nostromo tasted the dust and ashes of the fruit of life into which he had bitten deeply in his hunger for praise. Without removing his head from between his fists, he tried to spit before him, Tifuyu, and muttered a curse upon the selfishness of all the rich people. Since everything seemed lost in Sulaco, and that was the feeling of his waking, the idea of leaving the country altogether had presented itself to Nostromo. At that thought he had seen, like the beginning of another dream, a vision of steep and tideless shores, with dark pines on the heights and white houses low down near a very blue sea. He saw the quays of a big port, where the coasting feluccas, with their lateen sails outspread like motionless wings, enter gliding silently between the end of long moles of square blocks that project angularly towards each other, hugging a cluster of shipping to the superb bosom of a hill covered with palaces. He remembered these sights, not without some filial emotion, though he had been habitually and severely beaten as a boy on one of these feluccas by a short-necked, shaven Genoese, with a deliberate and distrustful manner, who, he firmly believed, had cheated him out of his orphan's inheritance. But it is merciful decree that the evils of the past should appear but faintly in retrospect. Under the sense of loneliness, abandonment, and failure, the idea of return to these things appeared tolerable. But what? Return? With bare feet and head, with one check shirt and a pair of cotton calzoneros for all worldly possessions? The renowned capataz, his elbows on his knees and a fist dug into each cheek, laughed with self-derision as he had spat with disgust, straight out before him into the night. The confused and intimate impressions of universal dissolution which beset the subjective nature at any strong check to its ruling passion had a bitterness approaching that of death itself. He was simple. He was as ready to become the prey of any belief, superstition, or desire as a child. The facts of his situation he could appreciate like a man with a distinct experience of the country. He saw them clearly. He was as if sobered after a long bout of intoxication. His fidelity had been taken advantage of. He had persuaded the body of cargadores to side with the blancos against the rest of the people. He had had interviews with Don Jose. He had been made use of by Father Corbelan for negotiating with Hernandez. It was also that Don Martin de Cud had admitted him to a sort of intimacy, so that he had been free of the offices of the Porvenir. All these things had flattered him the usual way. What did he care about their politics? Nothing at all. And at the end of it all, Nostromo here and Nostromo there. Where is Nostromo? Nostromo can do this and that, work all day and ride all night. Behold! He found himself a marked Ribierist for any sort of vengeance Camacho, for instance, would choose to take. Now the Montero party had, after all, mastered the town. The Europeans had given up. The caballeros had given up. Don Martin had indeed explained it was only temporary, that he was going to bring Barrios to the rescue. Where was that now? With Don Martin, whose ironic manner of talk had always made the capataz feel vaguely uneasy, stranded on the Great Isabel? Everybody had given up. Even Don Carlos had given up. The hurried removal of treasure out to sea meant nothing else than that. The capataz de cargadores, on a revulsion of subjectiveness, exasperated almost to insanity, beheld all his world without faith and courage. He had been betrayed. With the boundless shadows of the sea behind him, out of his silence and immobility, facing the lofty shapes of the lower peaks crowded around the white misty sheen of Higuerota, Nostromo laughed aloud again, sprang abruptly to his feet, and stood still. He must go. But where? There is no mistake. They keep us and encourage us as if we were dogs born to fight and hunt for them. The vecchio is right, he said slowly and scathingly. He remembered old Giorgio taking his pipe out of his mouth to throw these words over his shoulder at the cafe, full of engine drivers and fitters from the railway workshops. The image fixed his wavering purpose. He would try to find old Giorgio if he could. God knows what might have happened to him. He made a few steps, then stopped again and shook his head. To the left and right, in front and behind, the scrubby bush rustled mysteriously in the darkness. Teresa was right too, he added in a low tone, touched with awe. He wondered whether she was dead in her anger with them or still alive. As if in answer to this thought, half of remorse and half of hope, with a soft flutter of oblique flight, a big owl whose appalling cry, Ya acabó! Ya acabó! "It is finished! It is finished!" announces calamity and death in a popular belief, drifted vaguely like a large dark ball across his path. In the downfall of all the realities that made his force, he was affected by the superstition and shuddered slightly. Signora Teresa must have died then. It could mean nothing else. The cry of the ill-omened bird, the first sound he was to hear on his return, was a fitting welcome for his betrayed individuality. The unseen powers, which he had offended by refusing to bring a priest to a dying woman, were lifting up their voice against them. She was dead. With admirable and human consistency he referred everything to himself. She had been a woman of good counsel always, and the bereaved old Giorgio remained stunned by his loss just as he was likely to require the advice of his sagacity. The blow would render the dreamy old man quite stupid for a time. As to Captain Mitchell, Nostromo, after the manner of trusted subordinates, considered him as a person fitted by education perhaps to sign papers in an office and to give orders, but otherwise of no use whatever and something of a fool. The necessity of winding round his little finger almost daily the pompous of tested self-importance of the old seaman had grown irksome with use to Nostromo. At first it had given him an inward satisfaction, but the necessity of overcoming small obstacles becomes wearisome to a self-confident personality as much by the certitude of success as by the monotony of effort. He mistrusted his superior's proneness to fussy action. That old Englishman had no judgment, he said to himself. It was useless to suppose that, acquainted with the true state of the case, he would keep it to himself. He would talk of doing impracticable things. Nostromo feared him as one would fear saddling one's self with some persistent worry. He had no discretion. He would betray the treasure, and Nostromo had made up his mind that the treasure should not be betrayed. The word had fixed itself tenaciously in his intelligence. His imagination had seized upon the clear and simple notion of betrayal to account for the day's feeling of enlightenment as to being done for, or having inadvertently gone out of his existence on an issue in which his personality had not been taken into account. A man betrayed is a man destroyed. Signora Teresa, may God have her soul, had been right. He had never been taken into account. Destroyed! Her white form sitting up bowed in bed, the fallen black hair, the white-browed suffering face raised to him. The anger of her denunciations appeared to him now majestic with the awfulness of inspiration and of death. For it was not for nothing that the evil bird had uttered its lamentable shriek over his head. She was dead. May God have her soul. Sharing in the anti-priestly free thought of the masses, his mind used the pious formula from the superficial force of habit, but with a deep-seated sincerity. The popular mind is incapable of scepticism, and that incapacity delivers their helpless strength to the wiles of swindlers and to the pitiless enthusiasms of leaders inspired by visions of a high destiny. She was dead, but would God consent to receive her soul? She had died without confession or absolution because he had not been willing to spare her another moment of his time. His scorn of priests as priests remained. But after all, it was impossible to know what they affirmed was not true. Power, punishment, pardon, are simple and credible notions. The magnificent capataz de cargadores, deprived of certain simple realities, such as the admiration of women, the adulation of men, the admired publicity of his life, was ready to feel the burden of sacrilegious guilt descend upon his shoulders. Bareheaded, in a thin shirt and drawers, he felt the lingering warmth of the fine sand under the soles of his feet. The narrow strand gleamed far ahead in a long curve, defining the outline of this wild side of the harbour. He flitted along the shore like a pursued shadow between the sombre palm groves and the sheet of water lying as still as death on his right hand. He strode with headlong haste in the silence and solitude, as though he had forgotten all prudence and caution. But he knew that on this side of the water he ran no risk of discovery. The only inhabitant was a lonely, silent, apathetic Indian in charge of the palmarias, who brought sometimes a lot of coconuts to the town for sale. He lived without a woman in an open shed, with a perpetual fire of dry sticks smouldering near an old canoe lying bottom up on the beach. He could be easily avoided. The barking of the dogs about that man's ranch was the first thing that checked his speed. He had forgotten the dogs. He swerved sharply and plunged into the palm grove as into a wilderness of columns in an immense hall, whose dense obscurity seemed to whisper and rustle faintly high above his head. He traversed it, entered a ravine, and climbed to the top of a steep ridge free of trees and bushes. From there, open and vague in the starlight, he saw the plain between the town and the harbour. In the woods above some night bird made a strange drumming noise. Below, beyond the palmaria on the beach, the Indians' dogs continued to bark uproariously. He wondered what had upset them so much, and, peering down from his elevation, was surprised to detect unaccountable movements of the ground below, as if several oblong pieces of the plain had been in motion. Those dark shifting patches, alternately catching and eluding the eye, altered their place always away from the harbour, with a suggestion of consecutive order and purpose. A light dawned upon him. It was a column of infantry on a night march towards the higher broken country at the foot of the hills. But he was too much in the dark about everything for wonder and speculation. The plain had resumed its shadowy immobility. He descended the ridge and found himself in the open solitude between the harbour and the town. Its spaciousness, extended indefinitely by an effect of obscurity, rendered more sensible to his profound isolation. His pace became slower. No one waited for him. No one thought of him. No one expected or wished his return. Betrayed! Betrayed! He muttered to himself. No one cared. He might have been drowned by this time. No one would have cared, unless, perhaps, the children, he thought to himself. But they were with the English Senora, and not thinking of him at all. He wavered in his purpose of making straight for the Casa Viola. To what end? What could he expect there? His life seemed to fail him in all its details, even to the scornful reproaches of Teresa. He was aware painfully of his reluctance. Was it that remorse which he had prophesied with what he saw now was her last breath? Meantime he had deviated from the straight course, inclining by a sort of instinct to the right, towards the jetty and the harbour, the scene of his daily labours. The great length of the custom house loomed up all at once like the wall of a factory. Not a soul challenged his approach, and his curiosity became excited as he passed cautiously towards the front by the unexpected sight of two lighted windows. They had the fascination of a lonely vigil kept by some mysterious watcher up there, those two windows shining dimly upon the harbour and the whole vast extent of the abandoned building. The solitude could almost be felt. A strong smell of wood smoke hung about in a thin haze which was faintly perceptible to his raised eyes against the glitter of the stars. As he advanced in the profound silence, the shrilling of innumerable cicalas in the dry grass seemed positively deafening to his strained ears. Slowly, step by step, he found himself in the great hall, sombre and full of acrid smoke. A fire built against the staircase had burned down impotently to a low heap of embers. The hard wood had failed to catch. Only a few steps at the bottom smouldered, with a creeping glow of sparks defining their charred edges. At the top he saw a streak of light from an open door. It fell upon the vast landing, all foggy, with a slow drift of smoke. That was the room. He climbed the stairs, then checked himself, because he had seen within the shadow of a man cast upon one of the walls. It was a shapeless, high-shouldered shadow of somebody standing still, with lowered head, out of his line of sight. The capataz remembered that he was totally unarmed, stepped aside, and, effacing himself upright in the dark corner, waited with his eyes fixed on the door. The whole enormous ruined barrack of a place, unfinished, without ceilings, under its lofty roof, was pervaded by the smoke swaying to and fro, and the faint cross draughts playing in the obscurity of many lofty rooms and barn-like passages. Once one of the swinging shutters came against the wall with a single sharp crack, as if pushed by an impatient hand. A piece of paper scurried out from somewhere, rustling along the landing. The man, whoever he was, did not darken the lighted doorway. Twice the capataz, advancing a couple of steps out of his corner, craned his neck in the hope of catching sight of what he could be at so quietly in there. But every time he saw only the distorted shadow of broad shoulders and bowed head. He was doing apparently nothing, and stirred not from the spot, as though he were meditating, or perhaps reading a paper, and not a sound issued from the room. Once more the capataz stepped back. He wondered who it was. Some Monterist? But he dreaded to show himself, to discover his presence on shore, unless after many days would he believed endanger the treasure. With his own knowledge possessing his whole soul, it seemed impossible that anybody in Sulaco should fail to jump at the right surmise. After a couple of weeks or so it would be different. Who could tell he had not returned overland from some port beyond the limits of the Republic? The existence of the treasure confused his thoughts with a peculiar sort of anxiety, as though his life had become bound up with it. It rendered him timorous for a moment before that enigmatic, lighted door. Devil take the fellow! He did not want to see him. There would be nothing to learn from his face, known or unknown. He was a fool to waste his time there in waiting. End of Part 3, Chapter 8, Part 1 of Nostromo.